So I know a lot of you are kind of seasoned Persona veterans here, so you probably don't need this talk in terms of what Persona is, but one of the great things about these events that we found last year, and I think continuing this year, is we get a mix of people. Some people are kind of new to Personar, and so this is a chance to introduce them to that. So I do want to just give a kind of a quick talk of what is Personar, just so at least there's some hope of understanding what we're talking about the rest of the day. So just right out of the gate, what is Personar? So Personar is a set of software, but more importantly, it's an open source collaboration led by the 6 organizations listed there. So ESnet, GEANT, Indiana University, Internet 2, RNP, and the University of Michigan. And really the goal is to provide a set of software that performs network measurements, not just between like within a single organization, but really ultimately between organizations. To help kind of identify and troubleshoot common network issues. So Personar supports a number of different tests, but the 4 listed there, I still kind of think of as our bread and butter in terms of the main tests that people use in solving problems still. That this may change over time, but it's the throughput, the packet loss, the one-way latency, and trace route. And as I go, I'll just kind of show, I think, how people tend to use that. And so when we're thinking about these types of network issues, we really kind of like to categorize them into 2 broad buckets. So it's these hard and soft failures. So hard failures are the type where basic network connectivity just fails. You're just unable to send packets to the other end. And so these are things like fiber cuts and power failures, and probably things all of us have seen in one form or the other over the years. Now, these aren't always easy to fix, but we're generally pretty good at detecting these, monitoring systems in the NOC and things like that. Now, if you have an undersea cable cut or something, it's not easy to fix. You got to send out a boat and scuba divers and I don't know what else, but you can at least detect it, right? Then the other category is soft failures, and this is really kind of where more Personar fits in. So this is where basic network connectivity is functioning, but performance is just poor. And you can think of performance in multiple ways. Often that means just like a transfer is slow or something like that, right? And often these go undetected. Sometimes even users just come to get used to it and accept that as the best they can do. But kind of what Personar is designed to do is identify these cases, maybe in some cases set a baseline of where things are at, and help kind of start on the path towards correcting those. So I think kind of a good example of some of the types of stuff that we run into with these soft failures is if you think of like a data transfer and the research and education community, I think this is a pretty typical setup. This one specific is very, I guess, US centric. But let's say you have a university and they're trying to send to one of our Department of Energy labs in the US. And the university kicks off a transfer and, maybe it's doing some stuff within campus and things look good, maybe even going out to their, local regional network, maybe to another university within the state or whatever, that looks okay too in terms of performance. But then when they start transferring to a lab, maybe across the country and, hit networks like Internet 2 and ESnet to get there, performance is just bad. And so a logical conclusion in this case is like, well, if I can transfer locally, then, but it's slow when I go out, that obviously something in the middle, so something in that red circle in the diagram here is wrong. But in fact, that could be the case, but it could also be that something closer is actually the issue. So one thing we often run into is interface buffers maybe are too small. So as it's sending packets, it's basically overloading the interface, which causes us to drop packets. And as a lot of us know, that TCP doesn't, starts backing off and doesn't perform great in that case, and you get poor performance, right? So some of these can be a little bit tricky, and you have to, have really good visibility to a lot of pieces of the path to help pinpoint these. So this kind of puts numbers. This is a graph we've been showing for a long time. I think my colleague Eli Dart put this together a while ago, but it kind of shows the very large impact a very small amount of packet loss can have on a TCP transfer. So if you look at this top purple line, you can see that's supposed to be about 10 gigs. And as it gets further and further to the right, that's a longer RTT. So you can think of that as a further physical distance that the packet has to travel. And you'll see with no packet loss, as you go further and further out, from the local campus all the way out to international, you get some drop off in the throughput, go to around 8 gigs there. But nothing too huge, especially when you compare to the other 3 lines, which are cases where you have 0.0046% packet loss, or 1 in 22,000 packets getting dropped. You'll see a very steep decline, when you get out of the metro area, and the throughput's almost, in the hundreds of megabits or even less by the time you get to international, right? So these small things, if you're not watching for them, can have big impact on your users and the data. So get back to that in a second, but it's also worth noting, a really important aspect of being able to test these things is having lots of places to test, so you can look at different points in the path. So I think one of the big advantages Persona has is there's about 2,000 of these worldwide. Particularly if you're looking in the research and education community, we're embedded pretty well there. So you're able to test to a lot of different places is what it boils down to get the data that you need. Persona has also been around for quite a while. You'll see we have a timeline. This is from our website. It goes all the way back to 2001. I think the name Persona actually showed up in 2005. So it's been around in some form for about 16 years. This timeline has actually gotten so big, I can't even fit it all on one slide anymore. Yeah, we try to keep this up to date. So we've been around for a while. It doesn't obviously look the same as it did 15 years ago, but we've been involving it and learned a lot of lessons along the way. So how does this all work, right? What are we actually talking about in terms of software when we say Perfsonar? So Perfsonar isn't just kind of one monolithic thing. It's actually multiple software components that we package up and make available, with the idea that you'll kind of have a complete end-to-end solution in terms of being able to execute tests, schedule them, get results, and display them in some form, so you can analyze them and do all that. So this is kind of our standard architecture diagram here. Just real quick, if you look at the purple on the bottom, those are kind of the foundational tools that we run to actually run these tests. So when we say things like throughput, we're actually doing is running a command called iperf or iperf3 to measure that and get our results. So iperf3, for example, is one that is actually maintained within ESnet. So we have developers that work on it. Same with OAMP and TWAMP. Those are actually maintained by the Perfsonar collaboration. Some of these we have kind of direct control over the source. Others are just your standard Linux utilities like traceroute and tracepath and ping and things like that that you'll find on your everyday system, right? And so really kind of the core, what I think of as like the guts of Perfsonar is that P-scheduler section. That's kind of what makes everything kind of glue together. So P-scheduler is responsible for actually scheduling the tests and make sure they don't bump into each other. It'll execute the various tests. When it gets a result back, it will ship them off to wherever you tell it to send them. It's got a number of different plugins for doing that. And it's really kind of the key to making this all go. So I mentioned storing the results. That kind of brings us to the archiving box. We'll be talking a lot about this box today, especially in the talk after this. Currently, it's something called Esmond. If you've been following for a while, I kind of wish that box wasn't Esmond. We've been working to replace that for a while, and we'll be talking about where that work is at. But today, it's something we've developed called Esmond that stores those results. This orange box too is a configuration software that we have, so that allows people to kind of build these centrally managed kind of configurations, and multiple organizations can point at that. And it basically is instructions that tell the individual Persona host what test to run, and instructions for things like the web front ends, what to display. And then at the top, we have a bunch of visualization tools. If you use Persona, we'll be seeing some of these the graphs and Mad Dash and things like that we provide are all things you're probably familiar with. Then kind of bolted onto the side of this all is the lookup service registration. So we like to register the existence of all these pieces and where they're at. And that's how we do things like build that map that I just showed. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go to schedule. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about getting data out of the lookup service at the end of today. So then, we have all these pieces, and in general, we don't want people to have to be super familiar with all of them. And particularly when it comes to installing them, we don't want you to have to run like a dozen install commands or something like that to get it all working. So we bundle things up. And so our most popular bundle is called the Persona Toolkit, which includes pretty much all the things, or at least close to all of them, that I showed in that previous screen. This is kind of, I think of as like the introductory bundle that most people install when they're first getting familiar with Perfsonar. So you can either do something like yum install Persona Toolkit or apt-get install Persona Toolkit if you're on Debian, or we also provide an ISO still that is basically based on CentOS, and you can burn that to either, or you can mount that to a USB, which is what most people do, or you could still burn it to optical media as well, which used to be the more popular option, but I think that's shifted. Then you can install basically an entire CentOS operating system, but also have all the Perfsonar packages. And it'll have nice web pages for setting up the tests and looking at graphs and things like that. So kind of an easy way to get started with Perfsonar, and that is by far, I think, still our most popular bundle. As you get kind of more familiar with Perfsonar or want to have a bigger deployment, though, we do offer some other bundles. It doesn't maybe make sense to throw web interfaces and things on 50 hosts or whatever deployment you're doing. So we have things like the Perfsonar test point that just really limit it to the command line tools and the things you need to build a test schedule. It's also available as a Docker image as well, probably worth mentioning. And then you can centrally store tests as well. And that's where you have things like Perfsonar Central Management. So you don't have to run a bunch of archives all over the place if you don't want to. And so that's a pretty common setup. And there's also some automation around all this with Ansible and other things like that. So it's a lot of flexibility in how you install and set up your Perfsonar deployment. So how do people use Perfsonar? So I think a pretty common workflow is to use something called Mad Dash, where we have what we call these dashboards that consist of grids like I've shown here, and usually the endpoints of a test. So, sending data from one point to the other are the rows and columns there. So we'll see in this picture that that top host is at Argonne National Lab, ANL for short, and it's sending to various ESnet hosts, and they're sending back to it. So that bottom half of the box is the ESnet to Argonne direction. We'll see that there's some pink there. That's our basically colorblind friendly attempt to indicate maybe packet loss or that there's something not quite right with that transfer. In this case, this is a packet loss grid, so that's indicating there's presence of packet loss there. So when you see that, you can click on these boxes and get a set of graphs. And you'll see in this graph that one direction has throughput that's much higher than the other. The other direction, or you can also see too that there's packet loss in that same direction that's really not performing as well. And you also see a kind of latency hopping all over the place in that direction that's not performing as well. So we'll talk about, okay, so we've gotten this far, we've identified there's a problem, we've identified the direction, we've maybe even pinpointed kind of a set of hosts that are seeing this. But now we actually need to kind of figure out and solve the problem. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more in one of the next talks about, okay, how do we get to that next step of figuring out what's going on here? But that's the basic idea of the workflow when people are using Perfsonar. And so just kind of last intro thing, if you are new and aren't currently running a public Perfsonar node, we hope after today you'll be inspired to do so. It's really useful in debugging not only your own performance issues, but it helps other people to debug issues. And it's all open source software, and the requirements aren't huge in terms of system requirements. So in terms of hardware expense and things like that, we try to keep that minimal. And there's lots of good community input and different hardware configurations that people have tried. So I encourage you to look at bringing up one of those. And hopefully by being here, you're already thinking about that if you don't have one. So anyways, that was the intro. We'll pause again. I don't see any questions in chat, so just double checking. Okay, so then just a few last things on the updating on the Persona project. So just kind of want to highlight a few things that have been happening over the past year. A lot of these we'll get into in more depth as the day goes on, but hopefully give you a preview of what's coming in that respect. So I think probably the biggest or one of the most exciting things that happened this year, it actually happened in January, is you'll notice that there's 6 organizations listed. It actually only used to be 5 when we were doing this last year, at least. So RNP, the Brazilian National Research and Education Network, joined in January. They actually have a long history of Personar. If you look at that timeline, you'll see their name very early on. And they've were able to actually dedicate some developer resources and management resources to the project starting in this year. And so they were able to really hit the ground running. It's been awesome having them aboard. We've done multiple releases since then. Their software developers have made major contributions to all of those. As we'll see in the next talk, Daniel Neto and Juan Rios from RMP will be giving a talk with me on Persona 5.0, and they've done a lot of the heavy lifting on that release. So that's been great. So we're really happy to have them. So some other things that have been happening, we've had a few unexpected challenges the past year. And we'll talk about some more of these because some of them have kind of been external forces outside our control that have caused us to have to evaluate some things. So, first we've had a little bit of staff turnover at multiple of the organizations that have both kind of directly and indirectly affected things. Nothing major that probably most projects don't deal with. I think we've been kind of lucky in the past few years. We've had a very stable set of people working on it, and well, at least the count's stable. I don't know if mentally all of us are stable, but there's been just a little bit of that we've had to deal with and adjust things while we get people up to speed and all that. The other thing is CentOS, as I mentioned earlier, changed kind of the release strategy. I was actually looking at my slides from last year at Persona Day, and one of the things coming soon was CentOS 8 support. Not long after we had Persona Day last year, CentOS announced that CentOS 8 would stop being supported in December 2021. So actually a month from now. So we had to switch gears a little bit. And Mark will talk a little bit about that later this morning when he does his operating systems talk. We actually have something similar too then, not long after that. We've been planning to move to Elasticsearch. I mentioned that ESnet archiving box. And they did some switch up on their license, which just caused us to have to look at things. Nothing too huge, but we try and limit risk for all our users and things like that. And so I'll talk about that more in a few minutes at the next Persona, or at the Persona 5.0 talk that comes right after this. So just a few things we've had to work through. But in spite of all that, we've actually were able to get a couple kind of major releases out in the last calendar year. So we announced 4.3.0 at Persona Day last year. 6 months after that, we got 4.4 out the door. We have been trying to kind of increase the cadence of some of these major releases. I think generally we've gone a year or more sometimes without bumping that second number. So we're able to do this one in 6 months. The next big release will actually be Persona 5.0, which I'll be talking about next, which I think I've said a couple times at this point. But we don't have a firm date for that. As you'll see, when we demo things, we're actually pretty close in terms of packaging and all that. Just want to test things a little bit more, and hopefully we'll have a beta for that out pretty soon. But really the big focus will be the kind of long-awaited and often discussed dropping of the ESnet, which will open doors for us to do a lot of great integration and visualization things, I think, down the road. And so, like I said, we'll talk about that more next talk. So I think that's really all I had in terms of intro and update. Again, glad to see all the people joining while I was, yapping away here. Just remember the presentation are great chance to learn. I know everybody's in different time zones, so this can be challenging. So, encourage you to go back and look at the recorded videos if you're unable to see them live today. We have lots of discussions points too. We don't want just to be the developers talking at you. We do want this to be a dialogue. So, please take advantage of those opportunities to have a discussion, because I think those are always fruitful. And then be thinking about how we can make events like this better in the future. Maybe someday too, we won't have to even just do this virtually. Maybe we can do some in-person stuff. So that'll be exciting. But